Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all, and I understand that this is part of a larger series. It's really great that faith communities are engaging in this kind of learning, this kind of action. I think it's a really important thing and something that I really admire and enjoy seeing. So I am going to try kind of ambitiously.
Got a request to get close to the mic.
Okay. So I'm going to try kind of ambitiously to walk folks through the history of environmental law in this country a little bit, because it's something that I think most people kind of have a vague idea of what it is, and that it's a thing that matters for the environment. But I think most people don't have a clear sense of how that law functions and how it's evolved over time. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about the history of environmental law in the United States and why it is the way it is, and what it does and what it doesn't do, and then go from that to talking about present day efforts to address climate change and other issues. And then towards the end, I'll talk a bit about what we do at my current organization, Earthjustice, some of the different initiatives that we have, and how we see our advocacy fitting into the larger picture of environmental law and environmental policy. And I'm hoping at the end that there will also be time for folks to ask questions and have some conversation if people are interested in that. I don't want to talk at you for 45 minutes. So hopefully my aim is to end somewhat before that and provoke some conversation. And you're also welcome to ask questions as I go. If things come up, feel free to raise your hand, and I'm happy to have this be more conversational at any given point. So the way I think about environmental law is that the law is really a way of enacting and operationalizing our values about the environment. Our values get translated into policy through the law. We all have ideas. There are ways that society functions. Our society, it matters a lot what the laws are that govern our behavior. And that's especially true in the things that in the aspects of the world that environmental policy touches. It matters to make sure that things don't get too polluted. It matters that people stay safe. And these are age-old functions that government plays of ensuring that people have health and safety. And that health and safety, the tools that government has in order to, or the tools that we have through our government to try to address those kinds of issues, ultimately are our system of laws. And so the way laws get enacted is there's a reason for it. There's some societal problem, some challenge that needs to be addressed. And the idea to create some sort of legal fix for that, some sort of legal mechanism to address it becomes imperative, and then a law is passed, ideally to put those values into practice. It doesn't always work exactly like that. As we know, lawmaking is a very imperfect thing. But if we think about our body of environmental laws, I always want us to be thinking back to what the values are that underlie them and what the policies are that those laws create. And on top of that, there's one other thing, which is what the interests are of various parties that are negotiating over what those laws are and what they mean. Those laws don't embody my values perfectly. And the reason they don't embody my values perfectly is because there are people and entities, companies, institutions that have interests that might be different from mine, and they're also involved in the legislative process, making laws. They're also involved in the legal process. And so it's an interplay of different interests kind of combining and in some cases competing to get their values embodied in environmental law. So industrialization has yielded a lot of benefit, and it's also yielded a lot of what economists call negative externalization of costs, negative externalities. And the idea behind that is that not everything that a company does is something that it necessarily has to bear financial or legal responsibility for. Sometimes, if there's economic activity, the cost of that activity can be passed on to a different or larger group of people. And that creates problems. So an example might be if there's a polluting industry, let's say it's an industry that generates water pollution through whatever its activity is. That water pollution goes into a river, and that pollution on that river affects everybody. It doesn't just affect the company. It doesn't just affect the customers of the company. And in fact, both the company and its customers have an incentive to make the best products and to make the products the cheapest. And they have that incentive even if it pollutes the river, because the pollution of the river is going to people as a group, not just going to the company. It's not being paid for by the company, and it's not being paid for by the consumer of the product, because that cost is being externalized onto the public. Does that make sense? And that is the concept. The concept of the negative externality, as economists call it, is a very central concept to thinking about why we regulate environmental problems. Because if you think about basic business and industry and commerce, it naturally creates a lot of those things. A company might not be trying to pollute the river, but it's the most natural thing to do if you're operating a business, to just let your pollution run off into the water or into the air if you don't have any incentive at all not to do that. And so this realization has created a bunch of need for legal remedies, because there didn't seem to be any other way of addressing this type of problem. And so one example of a legal remedy for that might be the person next door who's using the river could file a lawsuit and say, I have a right to clean water. You're creating a public nuisance by spewing your pollution into the water. I'm going to sue you to get you to stop doing the thing that you're doing. Those kinds of lawsuits used to be the only kind of environmental law we really had. And you might see how limited those might be in effectiveness. You have to have someone who has the resources to go to court and file a lawsuit. It's solved maybe one person at a time or one property at a time. It's not a kind of solution that lends itself to a society-wide set of systems. And what we have with industrialization in the 20th century and in the 19th century is a set of really dramatic system changes that caused coal smog that was fueled by coal that blanketed the entire city of London and the entire city of Pittsburgh, in very famous episodes that were not easily solvable through the kinds of mechanisms that the law had to offer. And over time, it became clear that government had to take a little bit more of a role in addressing these questions. And the mechanism for doing that is what we now call regulation. The idea that there should be some way to make sure that companies abide by a set of rules, and that those rules are commonly understood to reduce meaningfully the amount of pollution that we have in order to protect the public health. And so from that insight developed the concepts that we use today in environmental law. The idea that we have government agencies who are empowered to require, for example, an industrial facility to have a permit and to abide by that permit that says you can't emit more than this amount of air pollution. And if you do, you might be subject to penalties for doing it. Similar to a lot of other kinds of regulation. I mean, down to our individual driver's license. There are many things that in our lives that are regulated in some form because it is the most efficient way or effective way for society to address a challenge like that. And so environmental regulation started, I mean, there have been forms of it for 100 years now, but it started in a more meaningful way in the 1960s and then accelerated in the 1970s. And the types of environmental regulation we see today are really the legacy of the 1970s. There's a lot of questions that environmental regulation raises. What's the right place in government to regulate something? Is it the local government? Should a city council be making decisions about what pollution can and can't come out of a smokestack? Should there be a state agency that does it at the state level for all of California? Should it be somewhere in between? Should it be the federal government that has standards that protect everybody, no matter where they live in the country? And there are pluses and minuses to all of these different ways of addressing pollution. Now, you might ask, or you might not ask, what are the negatives to addressing pollution? And I think those negatives are pretty well represented in our media. That pollution is seen and often does have cost. Correction of pollution has cost to industry. The reason that an industry will pollute the river is because it is more expensive for them to do the things that would stop them from polluting the river than it is just to dump the stuff in the river. And so pollution control and environmental quality is often seen as being in tension with the economic priorities that our businesses collectively have. Sometimes that's not true. I don't think it's an entirely true narrative, but sometimes it clearly is true. And at least short term, it's true. If you have an industry like the auto industry that invested in building cars a certain kind of way in 1971, 1972, when the federal government came in and said, wait a second, we actually need you to do something really different because your cars are polluting. We need you to reduce the amount of nitrogen oxide emissions that comes out of your cars by 50% and then eventually by 90%. It's not surprising the auto industry would say, wait a second, we can't do that. That's not how we build things. It's going to be super expensive for us. You're going to pass those costs on to our consumers. And so we see this kind of debate everywhere in environmental law. It turns out that most of the time, those kinds of fears on the part of industry are overblown. That industry naturally will say, we're doing things a certain way, we don't want to change, it'll be too expensive, but that over time, it turns out you can make those changes. And actually, the revolution in cars in the 1970s through the 1990s is a great example of that, where the amount of pollution that comes out of the tailpipes of our cars went down really, really dramatically in a way that the auto industry had said was not possible. And that came at cost to the auto industry. It also came at great benefit. And so you can measure both of those things in imperfect ways, but you can measure them. How much did it cost the auto industry to make these changes? How much did that affect their workers on the one hand? On the other hand, what are the avoided health costs? What are the benefits that come from having the regulation? And it turns out that in cases like that, the benefits vastly outweigh the costs. The benefits to everybody who otherwise would be harmed by the pollution vastly outweigh the cost to the industry and to its consumers. But it's not obvious ahead of time, that the costs will shake out that way. And when the costs are borne by companies that have a fair amount of power in terms of lobbying and influence, it also makes it harder to pass and to sustain those kinds of policies. So environmental regulation tends to be pretty challenging, and that's true for a bunch of reasons. So one is that it's highly technical. Like when you're involved in environmental law, you start thinking about the difference between what it means for there to be this concentration of nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere versus this concentration and why that matters. And so you end up having to consult with and work with scientists who shed light on those questions. And then you have to figure out as a lawyer or as a regulator how to translate what the scientists say into something that actually might be workable in real life, that might be a standard that could be worked with. It tends to be very highly technical. And that makes it hard to pass laws about it also. Congress is not easily going to pass a law that says that the correct the correct maximum ambient air concentration for ozone should be 0.9 micrograms. That's not like the kind of law that Congress passes. So what typically happens is that those decisions are delegated by Congress to administrative agencies. And so there's a law that says that Congress has an obligation. There's a law that says that any pollutant that causes general health or welfare problems should be put on a list and studied, and that there has to be developed a maximum ambient air concentration of that pollution. And then we have to work towards making sure that that isn't exceeded anywhere in the country. And that's basically what the law says. I mean, there's a lot of other pieces to it. And then the question is, well, how does that happen? Well, there's an agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, that is tasked with figuring out what are the bad pollutants, what's the level, what's the maximum level that's safe in the air in order to have those, and how do we go about figuring out how to reduce those concentrations so that nobody in the United States is exposed to higher concentrations than that. That's a really big set of tasks. And spoiler, we actually haven't solved that problem yet, although we've come closer. The air quality here has gotten dramatically better since the 1970s. It's still not as good as it's supposed to be under the law. They still haven't met the attainment goals that were set even in the 1970s, and certainly not the goals that were set more recently than that. But the improvement is serious that we've had as a result of these laws and these very technical pieces of these laws. So just to flag one other thing that I think is important to note, there's a tension between different ways of thinking about what we're trying to accomplish with regulation. And the way I think about this is kind of a philosophical disagreement or tension between the idea, on the one hand, that we all have a right to a safe, livable, clean environment. I think if you ask most people, they would say, yeah, we have that right. And in fact, when you look at the text of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and other laws that were passed in the 1970s and are still in effect today, they embody that. If you can imagine it, picture a Congress where both parties vote for a law that says every person has a right to a clean environment, and we actually have steps to get there, and President Nixon signs that law. Kind of hard to imagine that in today's political environment, but it happened. And it was this very lofty aspiration, this idea that we all have this right. On the other hand, there's this idea also that those rights can't be infinite, because if those rights were truly infinite, it would mean that I would have a right not to be harmed by any industry anywhere. And then that might stop a lot of the economic progress that we see. And so there might be some place where my personal right to a clean environment might come into conflict or tension with a broader sense of what's good for society. And that might even be true where you're talking about environmental values themselves. So we create landfills in order to make sure that we're not all poisoned by waste all the time. We have places where we put our waste. That's good, because we're not living it like in the medieval times where people threw their waste out onto the street. And so we think of that as a very modern innovation, the idea that we put our stuff in these contained places where they're not going to harm anyone. It turns out that the people who live right near those landfills are deeply harmed by them. So that's an example of this tension, right? If they have a right to a clean environment, we have not done right by them by putting the landfill there. But maybe there's nowhere we can put a landfill then, and we have to put our waste somewhere. And so those kinds of tensions appear everywhere in environmental law, the tension between what's going to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people, a sort of utilitarian calculus of what is right, versus the idea that everybody just has a right to have a safe and clean and healthy environment. And you see that playing out everywhere. So we have laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act that declare a right to a safe environment. But when you look at the details of them, they're actually making a lot of trade-offs. They're saying, they're saying, well, we have to require water treatment systems to make these improvements as long as it's technologically feasible for them to do it. We don't say they have to do it no matter what. We say they have to do it as long as it's technologically feasible. And that might mean that they have to do it as long as it doesn't cost so much that it'll put them out of business, for example, which is a different thing than saying they have to do it no matter what. Because they have to do it now no matter what might mean that some businesses actually have to go out of business because if that's what we need in order to protect people's health. And so there's always choices being made about the ways in which we regulate. So we regulate in the areas, I mean, I broadly, air quality, water quality, waste, toxic substances, even aside from waste, like the stuff that the chemicals that are in our products, and what we can broadly think of as nature, biodiversity, animals, and ecosystems. We have federal laws from the early 70s that reflect all of these different values and that reflected our first serious national attempts to address all of these questions. We also have state laws, and California was a pioneer, back in the 60s of creating some of the first state laws around these very same issues. Um, the so any type of regulatory scheme that deals with these kinds of questions has to answer a bunch of questions. What is it that we're regulating? What are the bad things that we think are bad enough that we care about that we're going to ask people to pollute less of? What are the activities that create those bad things? Let's identify them and figure out, what they are. What are the things that we think that these companies could be doing differently? So some cases it might be fairly straightforward. You have pollution coming out of smokestack, and there might be the ability to develop technologies that filter the pollution from coming out of the smokestack, and just, people will have to invest in that and pay more money to produce their product, but the filter then prevents the pollution from getting into the atmosphere. We essentially have that in our gas-powered cars now. The development of the catalytic converter in the 1970s was a consequence of regulation for which the catalytic converter was the solution. And so we have a lot of examples of those types of regulations. We used to have sewage and stormwater going straight out into the ocean in many cases. We now have most sewage systems now in the United States have treatment systems that were mandated by these laws and that took decades to develop. Stormwater is still more complicated. We still have stormwater that's polluted going out into the ocean, but we have many, many steps that are being taken over time to improve that. So again, in the 70s, we had new laws, kind of this consensus, new powers given by agencies to address, kind of like to address whatever might happen in the future. So that's the other piece of this, is that when Congress wrote these laws, it said, essentially, we don't know what the bad pollutants are going to be. We're going to delegate that to the Environmental Protection Agency and give it the authority to figure out what are the things we need to regulate and how do we need to regulate them. Today, that notion is pretty controversial. There's a movement in the courts by judges you might think of as more as generally Republican appointed, more conservative judges who have a really different view of how appropriate it is to delegate those kinds of decisions to agencies. I would suggest that it would be unworkable not to delegate those decisions to agencies, because the idea of having Congress be the entity that makes the decision at what level of ozone pollution is safe for people coming out of this kind of facility. That's never going to happen, and it really couldn't happen because of the lack of expertise at Congress's level. So I think, to my mind, that kind of delegation is the only way to accomplish this. And if you don't do that kind of delegation to agencies, you're not going to have, you're abandoning the idea of environmental regulation, in my view. So ever since, getting to the world of law, one dynamic that has happened as a result of all of this is the industry of environmental law was born. And so we have lawyers whose job it is to work for regulatory agencies, developing standards. We have lawyers who work for companies, helping them to fight the standards in court and to argue that they should be weakened, but also in many cases helping companies just to understand how to comply with the standards and to help them comply with the standards. And I would say the majority of private sector environmental lawyers are probably in that category. Their work is mostly the work of making sure that companies that have to comply with very sophisticated environmental regulations are capable of doing that and have the tools and the knowledge that they need in order to do it. But they also, there's also a part of that industry that is fighting the rules being more stringent. And then we have a sector of public sector lawyers, the lawyers that are advising our state and federal agencies, our Air Resources Board in California, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. There's a whole, a whole generation in the 1970s that developed of lawyers whose job was to create the first generation of these regulations and then defend those regulations in court when the auto industry challenged them. And then that continues to the present day. And then there's also environmental lawyers in the nonprofit sector where I am now, who have been fighting since the early 70s for stronger protections. And that's my job now. I work for an organization that sees ourselves as fighting in every place that we fight for the protections to be stronger, knowing that there are people fighting for the opposite on the other side of it. Having spent 20 years in academia, I can also say that there's a very serious academic environmental law community as well. People who try to study and collaborate with scientists and figure out kind of in a more conceptual way what's the right way to do environmental policy. One thing to think about also is there's an emerging awareness of environmental justice, the idea that we have disproportionate impacts of environmental harms and also of the solutions to environmental harms on disadvantaged communities, on communities of color, on low-income communities. And in the 1970s, when these laws were passed, the big federal laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, there wasn't an awareness of that. I think it's fair to say that that was not on anybody's mind at that time. No one was imagining that the problem with any aspect of our environmental problem was this concept of disproportionate harm on different communities. And that's very much reflected in our laws. So for example, the way the Clean Air Act works, each region has its own air basin that's defined, and each air basin is designated as being in attainment or out of attainment with air quality standards. The air basin here is pretty big. There's a big air basin that includes both coastal Los Angeles and also out here and also east of here. Over time, that has resulted certainly in cleaning up the areas, in making the air cleaner in Riverside County and in this part of LA County. But one thing that the Clean Air Act didn't ask is, what does the air look like neighborhood by neighborhood or block by block? It only asked the question, what does the air quality look like in this region? So there's a whole big handful of air monitors in different parts of the region. I mean, it's not like Redlands or Riverside or Pomona is left out. There is an air monitor in those places, I believe. But there isn't an air monitor in every part of those neighborhoods. And so the people who live right next to the freeway or across the fence line from an oil refinery, their air is not counted the same way when the Clean Air Act makes its accounting of whether it's done its job. And that's just the way the law is written. The law was written to clean up big air basins. It wasn't meant, it was not meant to ensure that the air is safe on every block within those basins. And so an emerging trend over the last 20 years has been to try to care more about those things and to try to build policy that cares more about the neighborhood impact on what we call frontline communities that actually are impacted the most. And our laws are imperfect at that. And it's one of the things that we've been trying to do is to try to figure out strategies for creating more protection for those communities and not just saying the whole air basin looks better, we're done. So this brings us to the present day. Climate change, of course, as I'm sure you've heard in some of the other talks, I'm sure you're all aware anyway, has become an existential issue here. And until about the maybe 2006, 2007, there wasn't any such thing as climate change in the law. There were no laws that addressed climate change in any way, except in the most incidental way. Because it wasn't seen as an issue that policy needed to address. That began to change in large part because of some efforts here in California, but also at the national level to try to suggest that the prohibitions and the limitations on pollution in the Clean Air Act should be applied to greenhouse gases, to carbon dioxide, and not just to conventional pollutants. And I think you all probably know the difference between those two things, that carbon dioxide doesn't harm you by breathing it in the way that, that other pollutants do. Carbon dioxide is harmful because the aggregate of the carbon dioxide we emit is all creating a heating effect on the globe, which is having these widespread impacts. It's a different kind of pollutant because all the other pollutants that we're aware of, all the non-greenhouse gases, the way they work is if they get emitted near you, it harms your health or it harms the health of creatures or whatever. But carbon dioxide functions differently as a pollutant. We didn't really have a way of dealing with this in our legal system. And so there were efforts made to try to figure out how do we do this? Do we pass new laws? Do we try to creatively use existing laws and apply them to carbon dioxide? And those debates are still going on. They have not been resolved, but in the meantime, we have a lot more legal firepower going to addressing these challenges. And particularly here in California, there's a whole set of regulatory schemes that are based specifically on regulating greenhouse gases. Now, something important to keep in mind, greenhouse gases are a different kind of pollutant in another way as well. All the other pollutants we have, we can think of as byproducts of combustion. So you burn gasoline or you burn wood and you get soot, which is a pollutant. You get nitrogen oxides, which are a pollutant. You get carbon monoxide. You get all these pollutants. And each of those pollutants is a byproduct. And all those byproducts can be contained in some way. They can be filtered. There's always some way of reducing the byproducts from the combustion, even if you can't get them to zero. But carbon dioxide is different. Carbon dioxide is actually the main product of combustion. If you burn a 10-pound log, you get, there must be a chemistry major here, 24 pounds of gaseous carbon dioxide ends up in the atmosphere from burning that 10-pound log because each carbon atom combines with 2 oxygen atoms. And then that gas is what is the main product of the combustion. It's kind of weird to think about it that way. It's hard to even think about gas having that much mass, but in fact it does. When you burn a log, where does that go? It goes into everything that isn't the ash is actually going up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide in a mass that's more than double the mass of the original log. And there's no way to not do that because that's the thing that happens when you burn something. And so the realization that many of us had is we actually have to stop burning things for fuel ultimately, because there's no way to keep burning things and solve this problem through continuing to burn things, which is revolutionary. And many people think not revolutionary in a good way, but it's what we have to do ultimately in order to address this challenge. But it requires a whole different way of thinking about regulation also. Regulation used to be, what are the filtering things that we can put on our smokestacks and on our tailpipes to make things pollute less? We can't think about pollution control that way anymore. We have to think about it as a transformation of our energy systems now, so that we are now, wherever possible, not burning things to make energy. So a lot of the work that we do at Earthjustice is that work. We have our program that we call Right to Zero. The Right to Zero program is about getting to zero emissions. It's about electrifying our transportation systems. It's about electrifying our industrial systems wherever we can. We're very focused on freight movement. We're focused on the Amazon trucks that go through people's neighborhoods, but also ultimately on the large 18-wheeler trucks where the technology is getting there and making sure that there's the charging infrastructure to do that. A lot of our advocacy is for that. On the other side, a lot of our advocacy is to stop taking oil out of the ground, especially near where people live. In Kern County and also in parts of urban Los Angeles, we have oil wells right near where people live that are extracting a lot of oil out of the ground. And ultimately, we have to not do that. And so we are setting the groundwork for making sure that new wells don't get permitted. So those are the kinds of things that we do at Earthjustice. We fight in court. We also fight in administrative agencies to get better rules. We also have stuff that isn't related to climate change. We protect salmon in Northern California from having all the water taken out of their streams and rivers for agriculture. And we do a lot of work on pesticide regulation, both to protect bees and other pollinators and also to protect farm workers. It turns out that they're spraying of pesticides with very, very little attention being paid to the impacts that that's going to have on farm workers and on communities that are right next to the places where the pesticides are being sprayed. So, we're working in all these different areas kind of within this very, very complex environmental law system. I've been really lucky to have a career where I've been a generalist within environmental law. And so I know at least a little bit about a million things in environmental law. I'm not somebody who's like an expert on the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, but I've just been able to kind of to work in each of these different areas. Which I really enjoy because it gives me a very broad view of what the field is and what's going on right now. And part of my job is to figure out how do we at Earthjustice in our California program prioritize our work? What's the most important thing to work on with fairly limited? I mean, we're a very large organization, but we still have limited capacity. We have 600 people nationwide, 250 lawyers. We have about 20 people that I manage in California. 20 lawyers sounds like a lot, but it adds up pretty fast when you're working on big cases. You can't work on everything. So that's part of what we're doing is figuring out what do we think is most important to work on and working on those things. I've talked for too long. I'm going to stop and see if folks have any questions. Yes.
I don't know enough about Earthjustice, obviously, because I didn't know whether it was just a lobby organization or people are supposed to contribute to it. That sort of situation. Could you tell me not just how it started, but how it operates?
Yeah, sure. So first, how it started as the Sierra Club's Legal Defense Fund. We were the lawyers for the Sierra Club, a separate organization. At a certain point, it became clear that there was a broader need for legal support among the environmental advocacy community, and Earthjustice changed its name and its strategy in the 90s and became basically the main lawyers for the environmental movement. Our clients mostly nowadays are actually environmental justice oriented communities. We represent communities throughout the state in California that are grassroots frontline communities, and we represent them, doing legal work on their behalf. We also still represent Sierra Club and some of the other large organizations. Our work is mostly the work of lawyers, and that distinguishes us from some of the other organizations. We have a professional responsibility to our clients to represent them. We also do have other aspects to what we do. We do some lobbying. We determined that in order to be effective, we couldn't just be litigating lawyers. Sometimes you need to protect things through other means. And so we do have a team in Washington, D.C. that works on legislative advocacy. I do some work in Sacramento advocating, lobbying on bills. It's a relatively small piece of the work that we do compared to the work that we do that's really that really is legal work overall. Yes.
So if you're successful, more and more successful, are you being funded better as you are more successful?
That's a great question. I wish I knew the trick to getting the more funding. So what we have found, so we are funded mostly by donations. We have membership donations. You can go on the website. I encourage you to and give small amounts of money. We also have very major donors. We also have foundation funders. We have found that over time, people, as we've done more work, we've grown because people see the value in our work. I mean, we now have a very massive budget as an organization, and we have to raise money for that budget. I would say some of it is, we do well when we're successful. It's true. We also do well when people perceive things as being under attack. To be very frank about it. I mean, so, I think every environmental nonprofit organization got an increase in donations in 2017. I don't think that's unique to us at all. And it's unfortunate, but it's something that was really valuable to our organization to be able to have those resources. But yeah, I mean, we've tripled in size in less than 10 years, I think. And I think that does reflect both our success, but also people's fears and hopes and, all the ways in which people, feel like they're counting on organizations like ours to do this work. And a growing awareness, I think, of this as an issue. I think people are growing into the idea that environmental issues should be at the top of their list of concerns. Yes.
So it's going to be simplistic, but if the EPA has decided that 2.3 is a level or whatever, and then it's going to be challenged. I understand that if we're challenged by a scientist from a company, that might go to court. What happens if that is now being challenged by the new administration who wants to wipe out employees from the EPA and put in others? Can they just change the number?
So yes and no. So they both, I sound like such a lawyer. It depends. What any administration, what any president and any president's EPA have to do is they have to follow a set of rules that are set out in a federal law called the Administrative Procedure Act, and they also have to follow the law as the environmental laws as they're written. So Donald Trump can't lawfully just decide I'm going to ignore this, this thing that the previous administration did. Their EPA can't immediately issue an order that says, never mind. But what they can do is they can start a new rulemaking proceeding. And then that new rulemaking proceeding can be used to ultimately justify a weaker rule. And in fact, we saw that. We saw that under the first Trump administration. We saw it under the George Bush administration. And we've seen the opposite under the Biden administration. There's also sort of a seesawing, but it's a very laborious and lengthy process to revise a rule. And if the revision of the rule isn't supported by science, we can challenge the new rule. And in fact, the Trump administration famously lost hundreds of court challenges on its rulemakings because it did a very poor job at justifying a lot of the rollbacks of rules that it made. So our job in that situation is to challenge the new weaker rules and say, no, court, you have to tell them to go back to the rule that was actually justified by the science. But it is complicated, and it's complicated in part because agencies do have a lot of discretion. And so it might be that it's not 100% clear exactly what the right standard is, and that it could be a weaker one or it could be a stronger one, and both of those might theoretically be within the law to do. And in those situations, we might not win a lawsuit if we challenge it, if a court ends up deciding, well, it's a weaker rule, but it's still within the agency's authority to do that. So we'll see. I'm obviously hoping we're not in that position, but that it does have some precedent.
Could you tell us about one case that you worked on this year that has given you exceedingly much pleasure?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess this has been really abstract. So, this I can't take credit for this case because I came to it very late in the case, but Kern County developed a program where instead of doing an environmental review every time that it issued a new permit for an oil well, because there's a lot of oil wells that are being developed there, they developed a plan that essentially said, we're going to do a very high-level review of all the stuff we plan to do in the future with oil wells. And then when we do permits for individual oil wells, we're just going to push them through. We don't have to do any sort of site-specific environmental review. Does that make sense? And we challenged that. We actually challenged it several years ago, and we were successful in challenging it by saying that they had done such a poor job with their environmental review of the big program. They had missed so many things in doing that that the court had to throw it out. They went back and they did it again, and they didn't fix everything. And we sued them again. And just a few weeks ago, we won that second lawsuit. I mean, so among the things they did, so there's wells, there's wells all over the place, and some of them are not near where people live, and some of them are right near where people live. And so one of the things that they did is they did a health risk assessment, and that health risk assessment didn't adequately assess the impacts that the wells closest to where people live were going to have. they looked kind of further out at wells that, and we're like, well, they can't do that. They have to look at the ones that are the closest to where people live, and because those are the ones that are likely to do the most, you know, to create the most harm. And they contended that they hadn't done anything wrong by doing it that way. We challenged it in court and we won. What was gratifying to me in part was that it was very clear from some of the statements that the companies made that that this actually had a direct impact on their permitting of new wells. They downgraded substantially their prediction of how many new oil wells they were going to be building in that area. And I was like, we had a real impact here, and I was proud of that. We work directly with community groups in Kern County also, and it's really gratifying to work with on-the-ground groups on cases like that.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Been a great presentation. I wish we could have time for more questions, but I want to urge each one of you to please come next week. This will be our last in the series, and it follows what you've just been talking about. Mario Daganel is going to be speaking from Tree People, an organization that has been in Southern California for 50 years, and he's going to be talking about community organizing, and not only community organizing, but the interconnections with shade equity in disadvantaged communities. And so I think it follows exactly what some of the things that you've been talking about. So thank you again so much for coming.
I just saw there's questions in the Zoom chat that I don't think I'm going to be able to answer. But
Take 1 minute.
All right. All right. For those of you on Zoom, let me see. Oh, I don't know that I have good answers to these questions. So one of the questions is about youth sports disregarding air quality when they're scheduling practices, which you know, I feel like that's just something where you have to advocate at your local schools and sports teams to make sure that there's attention paid to safety. I don't think that there's an environmental law way of addressing that, except for the obvious thing that we have to improve all of our air quality. And then the second. Thanks. Sure.
Appreciate it.
All right.
We got an Earthjustice song we're singing today.
Thanks, everybody. Sorry not to get to everything. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, maybe I didn't allow more questions before I